Welcome to Carmel Holocaust Memorial Service, and thank you for taking the time to mark this important day. Holocaust Memorial Day enables us to remember for a purpose. This year's theme is Be the Light in the Darkness. It encourages everyone to reflect on the depths humanity can sink to, but also the ways individuals and communities resisted that darkness to be the light before, during and after genocide. Let's watch this short video explaining a little more about why we gather in this way and the parts we can play to bring light to our own communities.
The 27th of January is Holocaust Memorial Day, the International Day of Remembrance for the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, Nazi persecution and subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda and Darfur. It gives us an opportunity to reflect on the consequences of discrimination and persecution and learn the lessons of the past.
Between 1941 and 1945, the Nazis attempted to annihilate all of Europe's Jews. This systematic and planned genocide is known as the Holocaust. From the time they assumed power in 1933, the Nazis used propaganda, persecution and legislation to deny human and civil rights to Jews. Jews were denied citizenship, forbidden to marry non-Jews, to own businesses and to live in certain areas. The Nazis used centuries of anti-Semitism as their foundation. Nazi persecution extended beyond Jewish people, political opponents, the Roma and Sinti people, disabled people, gay people, Jehovah's Witnesses, Freemasons and black people were all targeted and hundreds of thousands of people were murdered. By the end of the Holocaust, 6 million Jewish people had been murdered in ghettos, mass shootings, concentration camps and extermination camps.
I was 16 years old when we arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Within minutes, I got separated from my mother and 2 sisters. A few minutes later, I got separated from my father. I had no opportunity to say goodbye to them. And from that day onwards, I never saw them again.
After Auschwitz, Eugene was imprisoned at the Buchenwald concentration camp. He was forced to work in the tunnels at the Dora Mittelbau labour camp and was finally imprisoned in the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen.
The scenes in Bergen-Belsen were terrible. There were dead bodies lying all over. The place was infected by typhus. I personally came down to 5 stone.
For 50 years, Eugene said nothing of his ordeals, but now he speaks regularly about the atrocities that he experienced in his youth. In doing so, he has joined a group of survivors who work extremely hard to make sure that the Holocaust will never be forgotten.
I've been speaking to universities, colleges, schools for 65 years, ever since I came over to this country in 1946. I've made numerous films about the Holocaust, particularly about Auschwitz, about my time on the death march, and I have even taken some neo-Nazis back to the camp. It is very important that people understand what happened and learn something from what happened in the past, because we have no guarantee today that it cannot happen again. We believe it can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time.
Sadly, in the years that have passed since the end of the Holocaust, the world has seen genocide take place again and again. In the 1970s, the Khmer Rouge systematically evicted the population of Cambodia from its towns and cities and forced everyone to work on huge collective farms. Anyone who refused or moved too slowly was killed.
For 3 years, 8 months and 20 days, we were forced to labor, to work in the rice field. from sunrise to sunset, with only 2 bowls of rice soup a day. Jenny, my daughter, was 9 when she died, and she died of starvation because I had not enough rice to give to her. To look at your daughter slowly dying of starvation, this is really hard for a mother, and I will never forget this.
In Cambodia, the number of people murdered reached 2 million. In Rwanda, using little more than clubs and machetes, members of the Hutu people massacred almost 1 million men, women, children and babies who belonged to either the Tutsi people or moderate Hutus.
It was 10 o'clock in the morning when the militias come to attack in our house, and I managed to escape, just jumping through the window, but my family couldn't make it. I climbed the tree, which was in the backyard. I could hear the sound of crying and mourning inside the house. But unfortunately, a few minutes later, those sound has stopped. That's when I knew everybody was dead.
In former Yugoslavia, the Serbs targeted Bosnia in their wish for political domination. They were prepared to achieve this by isolating and even exterminating ethnic groups.
I was taken away together with my brother and the rest of the villagers, and I ended up in the Omorska concentration camp. During my stay in the Omorska camp, I was treated worse than a rat. My life was worth less than life of a rat. The worst aspect of being kept in the Omorska camp was the fact that the place was guarded by my former schoolmates, former neighbours, former policemen whose protection I relied before the war, and even former teachers.
But lessons remain unlearned. Genocide is still taking place today. Right now, in the Darfur region of Sudan, against a backdrop of civil war and with the backing of the Sudanese government, members of the Arab population are currently persecuting black African farmers who they see as inferior people. To date, millions of people have been displaced and hundreds of thousands of men, women and children have been murdered in Darfur. On Holocaust Memorial Day, we have a chance to think about what we can do to put an end to persecution and discrimination.
My hope for the Holocaust Memorial Day is for the people to learn about the genocide so that it won't happen again.
The more people commemorate the Holocaust on Holocaust Memorial Day, the more awareness there will be of the dangers and the more people will learn.
I hope that the Holocaust Memorial Day can inspire people, especially young people, to understand that they can make a difference, that one person can make a difference.
I want to ask young people, as they are the decision makers of the future, to learn the lessons of the past so that these crimes will never happen again.
My dearest wish and hope is for us to live in harmony, to respect each other, and learn to live and let live.
We all have the opportunity to use Holocaust Memorial Day to learn the lessons of the past to create a safer, better future.
Be the light in the darkness is both an affirmation and a call to action for everyone marking Holocaust Memorial Day. We have just heard about many different forms of darkness from the survivors who shared their testimony in that film. Amid the darkness of genocide, there have, however, always been those who oppose the regime, risking their own lives, homes and communities. Maintaining faith and culture during genocide defies the ambitions of regimes to eradicate entire groups and their culture. survivors emphasise that any kindness, when surrounded by suffering, indifference and persecution, is powerful. In this next clip, we hear how, even in the midst of terrible atrocity, those willing to shine a light in the darkness have brought hope and compassion to those suffering, often in their final moments.
My mother, brother, and I stayed together, but we were separated from my father. We never saw him again.
The inspiring story of Helen Aronson and her father Martush, continuing to light the way with kindness even as he reached the end of his own life. Today, increasing levels of denial, division and misinformation in our world mean we must remain vigilant against hatred and identity-based hostility. The utterly unprecedented times through which we are living currently are showing the very best of which humanity is capable, but also, in some of the abuse and conspiracy theories being spread on social media, the much darker side of our world as well. We can all stand in solidarity. We can choose to be the light in the darkness in a variety of ways and places, at home, in public, and online. And we are called to be so, as we hear in the Gospel of Matthew. And who would light a lamp and then hide it in an obscure place? Instead, it's placed where everyone in the house can benefit from its light. So don't hide your light. Let it shine brightly before others, so that the commendable things you do will shine as light upon them, and then they will give their praise to your Father in heaven.
When faced with a global pandemic that threatens our well-being,
Jesus calls us to be the light in the darkness.
When faced with the darkness of shame and rejection,
Jesus calls us to be a light shining in the darkness.
When faced by human beings who are not being treated in a dignified manner,
Jesus calls us to be a light shining in the darkness.
When faced with discrimination for being different,
Jesus calls us to be a light shining in the darkness.
when faced with injustices caused in the name of religion,
Jesus calls us to be a light shining in the darkness.
when faced by people who are unable to live in their own countries and homelands,
Jesus calls us to be a shining light in the darkness.
When faced with a lack of generosity towards refugees and migrants,
Jesus calls us to be the light in the darkness.
When faced with genocide,
Jesus calls us to be a light shining in the darkness.
when faced with denial of the Holocaust,
Jesus calls us to be a light shining in the darkness.
we look to the light of Jesus to inspire and guide us, so that as we reflect his light into the world, it is filled with love, peace, and harmony.
As we go forth today into a world of challenge and change, we remember the pain of the past.
As we follow God's command to let our light shine, we recognise the opportunity of here and now.
As we seek the truth and glimpse God's light in all places, we commit ourselves to sharing God's light through hope and love.
As we draw to the end of our service, we use the words of the poet Amanda Gorman, whom I'm sure many of you were inspired by at this week's presidential inauguration. And as the final song plays, I invite you to use that time to decide how you will be a light in our world, and to make a personal pledge of commitment to do so when faced with any kind of darkness this year.
We lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but to what stands before us. We close this divide because though we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so that we may reach out our arms to one another, and we seek harm to none and harmony to all.
When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
In a time full of war, be peace. In a time full of doubt, just believe. Yeah, there ain't that much difference between you and me. In a time full of war, be peace. In a world full of hate, be a light. When you do somebody wrong, make it right. Oh, don't hide in the dark, you were born to shine. In a world full of hate, be a light. La 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 la. In a place that needs change, make a difference. In a time full of noise, just listen. This life is but a breeze, better live it. In a place that needs a change, make a difference. In a world full of hate, be a light. When you do somebody wrong, make it right. Oh, don't hide in the dark, you were born to shine. In a world full of hate, be a light. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. In a race you can't win, slow it down. You only get one go around. 'Cause the finish line is 6 feet in the ground. In a race you can't win, just slow